We all have challenges in life: sadness, broken relationships, anger, bullying, grief, and isolation. But there is hope. Together, we can learn how to bring back joy, re engage with life, restore relationships, and to be alone without being lonely. Welcome to Psychology Talks.
Dr. Susan Stuntzner is back with us today, and she is going to talk with us about the importance of interacting well with someone who has a disability.
Thank you, Angela.
Yeah, so that's a really important topic. And so why don't we start with what it's like for someone who has a disability interacting with others in the community.
Okay. Well, living with the disability is really about more than the disability and condition itself.
Right.
People are often faced with the idea of what does this mean for me now that I have a disability or I'm living with one.
Right.
And as we talked about previously, there may be personal issues that come up, identity, things that come up. We've talked a little bit about the differences between invisible versus visible disabilities.
Right.
And all of these things and other factors affect how people view themselves, and it may affect interactions.
Right.
And so I think when we talk about the topic of disability, it can sort of be a sensitive subject for someone who doesn't have a lot of experience with people with disabilities, as well as it can be kind of a trying experience for some people who live with a disability.
Right.
There's always going to be variation on with both groups. But I think that whole misnomer of how do I talk about disability is really kind of what you're asking.
Okay, so let's go from there.
Okay. So what I have done sometimes when I have worked with larger groups, is I like to get an idea of what are people's responses or reactions or thoughts when they hear the word disability. Okay.
That could be a big one.
It can.
It could bring up some anxiety for people. I can imagine a number of different reactions.
Yeah. And so as you might expect, sometimes people will bring up stereotypes, things that they've heard or read or maybe beliefs. But the thing that I don't hear as much about are the positive side of disability. So when disability is present, it shows you what you're made of. Right. You learn about tenacity and perseverance.
Right.
Okay, or find meaning in your experience. Okay, some of these things that we know now do occur for people. But when it comes to that dialogue about how do I talk about disability or how do I approach somebody with a disability, there's still kind of some ambiguity and sometimes tension or awkwardness.
Yeah.
Social awkwardness, I think.
Yeah. So why don't we lay that out for people and help them to get more comfortable with that, or a little more educated about what that can and should look like.
Okay. Well, please forgive me because I do not have all the websites to rattle off the top of my head. But there is information out there about helpful tips in interacting with people with disabilities.
And we will put some of those resources up at the end of our show.
Okay, great. And so, but I think, what I would like to capture is that it's important that, to have a helpful and constructive interaction with someone with a disability. I think, it's important that both people, okay, the person with the disability, the person without a disability, have an understanding of what they want to bring to the conversation.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm going to give you an example of what you might see.
Okay.
Okay.
That'd be helpful.
Of maybe what's not helpful, then we can work our way into what could be helpful.
Perfect.
So let's say you have the gentleman or the woman who's trying, in their mind, they're trying to be helpful to the person with the disability by entering a building. So they, here's someone approaching a building who has a disability. Let's say it's a physical, because that's pretty concrete. So they rush ahead to open the door for someone, thinking it's helpful. Okay. However, that gesture may not be helpful.
Okay. Tell us why.
Okay. So if somebody has say if they're in a wheelchair or walking with leg braces or crutches or a walker, they may know their body better than anybody else. They know how they move. They know how many steps or pushes or how to work with their braces or canes, whatnot, to maneuver that social situation, that environmental obstacle. And so they know what they need to do, and they've got their sense of balance. So when the person rushes in to open up the door, it may cause the person to have an immediate reaction where, oh, now I need to stop, back up, and it may throw them off balance.
Okay, gotcha. So it's not so much in the act of opening the door, it's more about the approach and how you're opening the door.
And there's the assumption that we talked a little bit in another episode about the messages that people are sent. So where that offense might be is it may send the message that the person cannot do themselves. And maybe the person is someone who independence is really important. Or doing what they can for themselves is really important.
Okay. So you as a bystander, how do you negotiate that? So I'm from the South. I open doors for lots of people. So how do I still do that for people without offending them?
Okay. So mode of practice that is suggested is to ask the person if they would like assistance.
Okay. Can I get the door for you?
Correct.
Okay.
And not assume that because you see someone maybe who could benefit from assistance, it doesn't mean they need assistance or that they want assistance.
Okay.
Nor does it mean that your efforts would be the most helpful.
Okay. So asking. So asking is the key there. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about asking. So when it comes to asking, what's okay to ask and what's not okay to ask?
That is a very good question, Angela. Not an easy answer, okay? Because when we have the dialogue about living with a disability, some people will say, I would rather someone ask me about what's going on than stare or gawk or say something. Okay. Others might say, I don't want people asking me because that crosses a boundary. Okay. Now, while I do, and I'm going to touch on that one in a minute, because while I do respect that people may be curious and want to know, there's also a lot of good examples about when is asking crossing the line? So in an effort to be humorous, we'll see how this goes.
Okay.
I was given a training a few years back, and there was a letter written by a woman to Ann Landers. And the situation was that the woman had a visual guide dog. And long story short, people were asking her about I think the guide dog and herself and what's taking place. And I'm going to guess that she had been asked this a lot. And her, fast forwarding, her response out of this was, I don't mind so much talking about it, but it's almost like people expect me to answer that without knowing anything about them. So when I educate people about this, I say the offense is that you are asking something very private of another person when you are not sharing the same level of information about yourself.
Yeah. I think the same would apply to anyone. To have a perfect stranger come up and ask you a deeply personal question when they know nothing about you. They don't even know your name. And yet there's an expectation that you're going to answer and make yourself vulnerable to this person who you don't know.
Correct. And there's not that same level of sharing or divulging that goes on in reverse.
Right. It's not a reciprocal relationship.
It is not.
Yeah.
And so that's where some of the offenses, or can be, related is the fact that sometimes in these interactions, people may communicate the message that it's expected that you tell them.
Right.
Since when is it expected that we tell people very private information?
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great context to put it into for people.
So that whole, going back to your question, that brings up tension in the dialogue and discussion about disability.
Right.
So it's important that people approach this from the perspective of respect.
Right.
It's not that people won't talk about it, but people want to have a choice.
How is that choice given? Like, as the person that's curious or not wanting to offend, how does that person give that choice?
Well, I'm going to start off by saying, treat that person the same as you would anyone else. Think about how you might want to be treated and to be respectful that way.
Okay. And we all have a different tolerance for that.
We do.
And it's not going to be any different for someone who has a disability.
Right.
And so talk a little bit maybe about how these things impact the person who has the disability being approached in those ways.
Okay. So as I've tried to say, this is a difficult topic because there is a lot of variation. Some people will want to share and give others lots of detail. In an extreme example, it might be oversharing.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. And then others may not want to talk about it at all. And so I think part of it depends on how the person with the disability views it. Is it something that's viewed more private? Or do they feel like it's okay that others know it? And you're not always going to know that.
Yeah. And you're really only going to know that through a relationship with that person.
Right. And so, you have asked me previously, how do we open discussions about this? And so I think it's really important that each person living with the disability try to answer as honestly as possible for themselves. What am I comfortable with? Starting with yourself. If someone approaches me and I don't want to share everything, what are some ways I can handle that?
Yeah.
And kind of starting there.
Yeah.
As well as if the person is comfortable sharing, then it brings up how much am I willing to share? Because it's not education is great, and I think we change attitudes through understanding, but again, we are dealing with very private experiences, and sometimes the advent of disability involves trauma. So people asking an onlooker or outsider asking can be a traumatic experience, and asking somebody to relive that and relive it and relive it.
Yeah. And so what I'm taking out of what you're saying is that as a stranger, it's not okay, really. It's not okay to ask. It's not okay to go up to that person and say, what happened?
Right.
That it's dehumanizing, that it can be traumatic for the person with a disability. It can cause them to potentially relive something that they may have still very strong emotional reactions to, or maybe even PTSD around, post-traumatic stress disorder. So they're being very cognizant that it really isn't any of your business.
Right. And so I guess it kind of comes back to letting the person with the disability take the lead.
Yeah.
If they want to share it and how much.
Yeah.
And the other part that I think people often don't realize is when someone with a disability tries to open that door, even if they're not meaning to be offensive, the focus of the whole conversation is about the disability.
Right.
It's not who are you as a person,
Right.
what kind of hobbies do you have, do we have anything in common, gee, I like your shoes, okay, things that maybe other people care about.
Right.
The focus is on the disability, which is concerning because that can send negative messages about what's the most salient feature about that person as a human being.
Right. Absolutely. So let's talk about this in the context of the family dynamic and what that can be like for, say, a spouse of someone who has a newly acquired disability, or for the family member, the brother, the sister, the mother, the father, the grandparent, the aunt or uncle, whoever, of someone who maybe has had a disability from birth.
When somebody is born with a disability, I think it may be difficult for parents because, especially if somebody feels like they've done all the right things, and here I have a child with a disability, the experience for the child growing up might be a little bit different because this is their reality, this is who they are, and what they know. Okay.
And what you said, I think, is an important point. So I think this, to me, reminds me of the question that was asked of Christ when they said of the blind man, was this his fault or his parents?
Right.
And he said, neither.
Right.
And so I think that's an important message to get across, that there's not always a fault to what happens to anyone, regardless of what our circumstances. And if we go into a relationship, or we go into a conversation with someone trying to assess fault.
Right.
Then-
What did you do?
Right, yeah.
Or what did you not do?
Right, yeah. And I think that's especially salient for a parent of a newborn child
Right.
that's facing what could be a lifetime of very difficult circumstances.
Right. And, you know, when you just mentioned that, it brought up a saying that I came across a few years back that always stuck with me. And it is in the context of disability and Christ, that when people try to assess and figure out what it means to have a disability, that's not our job.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have the ability to see the grand design
Right.
and how every event happens, or why some people are born with a disability and others aren't. I mean, there may be something really great to come out of that, but we don't know the whole picture.
Right.
Only God does.
Yeah.
And that just always stuck with me. I was like, wow, that kind of captures it all.
Yeah. So let's talk about that family and what that is going to look like for them, and how they live well
Okay.
and help their child to live well.
Well, you know, when working with families, I think it's important to first try to understand that the family member is going to have their own coping process and figuring it out process. And the family is going to have theirs. And whether somebody is born with a disability or one is acquired later, I think initially the family can feel kind of invisible because the focus is on the family member. How do we take care of the family member? How do we assure that they have everything they need? And so sometimes parents and other family members can minimize what they need and other forms of support and kind of downplay it.
Right. So I can think of that in terms of, say, a sibling that feels overlooked because all the attention is now going to this other child, their brother or sister. But also, like you said, in terms of the parent then, and we see this oftentimes with caregivers, just across the spectrum of, not paying attention to their own care needs and then letting those suffer
Right.
in favor of the caregiving that they're providing.
Yeah.
Not recognizing that the research shows that when a caregiver doesn't provide appropriate self-care, that it can be detrimental to both them and the person they're caring for.
Absolutely. So, having time with the family member or the person you're caring for is important, but having time away is also important.
Yeah.
Whether it's in the form of respite or having time to pursue your own hobbies and interests, and I think families where it kind of the gut level clenches is I feel selfish doing that.
Yeah.
But it comes full circle, just like people need to take care of themselves, families and parents and siblings have that need to care for themselves so that they can then be there for others.
Right.
But I think it's hard for families to give themselves that permission at times.
Okay. So giving yourself permission to take the time that you need. And sometimes finding that time is difficult. It's difficult under the best of circumstances.
Right.
But when you have a child with a disability that has a high level of need,
Right.
whether that's they have a lot of physical concerns that they have to have maybe 24-hour care for, or maybe it's that there are more emotional concerns that are related to what's going on with the child that maybe they need help with that. And so it might be hard for them to find that time. So what are ways that people can go about getting that support?
Well, I think that's where it gets a bit tricky. Obviously, if people have larger families, maybe extended families, if they have support networks, people they trust in their life, finding that time away may be a little bit easier. Sometimes, and again, I think people may have to qualify for it, but sometimes the notion of respite care, where it's planned, like with DHS,
Right.
There's another person or family that spends time with your family member while you go do X.
Right.
May even be for the weekend,
Yeah.
every so often. But
Or maybe
I don't-
creating a schedule with, say, a spouse or a grandparent or another trusted person that knows how to provide the care
Yeah.
that's needed, has an understanding of the person, and then being willing to let them help you.
Right. Yeah. Asking for help is one thing, accepting help. And, I know we've talked a little bit about vulnerability, but letting people into your world,
Yeah.
I think, can be a challenge for some
Right.
families and people alike.
Yeah. So what are other things that people can do beyond self-care?
So another thing that people can do, I think, is when we learn about living with a disability it's about a perspective, okay? Learning to separate the disability from the person,
Right.
okay? That even though there's changes, the person is not the disability. So how we view things, I think, is key. And taking a look at that. I know I've mentioned it before, but spirituality, finding meaning in a situation. So oftentimes families find a higher purpose in a family member living with a disability. So I think a common, maybe more well-known situation would be, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers.
Yeah, absolutely.
That the event itself was very hurtful, but that led to an organization, social movement, saw that there was a gap somewhere that something needed to be addressed. And living with the disability is that same type of situation where sometimes families on the other side, or as they're working through coping with the family member's condition, that they find a higher purpose and kind of find one of those gaps that could be built or benefit.
Okay. So we didn't talk about this specifically in this regard, but I think the other piece that you've kind of already mentioned is having a support network.
Absolutely.
So we talked about it in terms of respite care, but I think also just in terms of emotional support and having people that are in your life that talk to you about things other than the disability.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I think, you keep asking me about what can families do, and this is really important, but I think one thing our society could be better at is addressing supports and resources for families.
Okay.
Because that's something that I think oftentimes it's been approached by, well, the family will be there, they'll figure it out. When in reality, sometimes it's the family that needs the support.
Right. So there are a lot of organizations. We talked earlier about there was a website that you have found, or there are a number of websites about being respectful and approaching people with disabilities and having interactions that are meaningful for both people. What about places that people could go to find resources about support groups or other ways of coping with living in a family with someone with disability?
Well, one resource that can be very useful for people with disabilities is are your local independent living centers, because these are organizations, they're nonprofit. They do peer counseling, self-advocacy, they connect people to resources, and if they don't have it, they're often a good starting place about what else is available in your community.
You had mentioned a statistic earlier that really was shocking to me, and so about the number of people that have a disability in America.
Yeah, statistics have been pretty consistent, but it's averages 1 in 5 people. So when you think about that, that's 20%. People with disabilities constitute the largest minority group within our country, but yet it's perhaps the least misunderstood. So when we talk about disability, it's not only people of a certain age group. I mean, that's from birth to death. And there's a lot of conditions and situations and disabilities, grouped in that. But again, it's really more prevalent than what I think we admit to ourselves.
Yeah. So when people think disability, maybe they can think, this is my mother, this is my father, this is me.
Right.
And so one way maybe to make the conversation more comfortable is to put it into that context. Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for being here with us today. I think this is really enlightening, and I think hopefully very helpful to a lot of people out there that are joining us in this conversation today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us.